Okay, today we're going to be looking at congruent triangles. Alright, now, we talked about congruent yesterday. We get a little more specific with its definition. It literally just means the same shape and the same size. So for a polygon like a triangle, that means that it has the same angles and the sides are the same size, the same length and sides. The same angles, the same size, then the triangles are congruent. Okay, so I'm going to draw two triangles here. And we're going to look at what congruent triangles look like. Okay, now, notice we've got a lot of markings here. We've talked about a lot of these before, but these are congruence marks. The side that has one tick mark is congruent to the side that has one tick mark. The one that has two tick marks is congruent to the other one that has two tick marks. And the one with three tick marks is congruent to the other one with three tick marks. Now, but this time, you also notice you have little arcs in the angles. They're kind of like tick marks, but they're in the angles. Well, they work the same way. You notice that angle C has one arc. Well, that means it's congruent with angle F because it has one arc. And then A up here has two, and so does D, so they're congruent. And B and E both have three arcs, so they're congruent. So they work the same way as the tick marks do. If two angles have the same amount of arcs, then that means they are congruent. Alright, one of the things you will have to do with congruent triangles is identify corresponding parts. Now, we talked about corresponding angles yesterday, and they were the angles that went together that matched. Well, this is basically the same thing. These are just the parts that match up to the other triangle. Okay, now we have two different parts. First, we have the angles. Okay, if you have a congruent set of triangles, then each angle matches one of the angles in the other triangle. So you need to be able to identify which angles are congruent. Okay, so in this triangle, you can see that angle A is congruent to angle D because they both have two arcs. You can see that angle B is congruent to angle E because they both have three arcs. And you can see that angle C is congruent to angle F because they both have one arc. Okay, so those are my three sets of congruent angles from these two triangles. Okay, then I also have corresponding sides. So I need to be able to identify them as well. Okay, I see that side AB is congruent to side DE because the side that's from A to B has one tick mark and the side from D to E has one tick mark. I also see that BC is congruent to EF because from B to C has two tick marks and from E to F has two tick marks. And I also see that CA is congruent to FD because from C to A is three tick marks and from F to D is three tick marks. Okay? Now, I also want you to notice that if you look at these corresponding angles and sides, they match up. If you see an A see this line segment starts with an A. Well, since A matches D, this line segment starts with a D. And since this is a B and that matches E, then the second one is an E on this one. So it always matches up. If B is first, then E is first. If C is last, then F is last. So it always matches up whether you're looking at the sides or the angles. Okay? This is how you identify the corresponding parts. Okay? You don't have to tell me what the measures are or anything like that, at least not for this part. You just have to be able to write which angles are congruent and which sides are congruent. Okay, now we are going to write a congruence statement. Okay, it's the way that you write that two triangles are congruent. Okay, so I'm going to draw some more congruent triangles here. Okay, now first you can see that they are congruent because they each side has another side that it matches, and each angle has another side that it matches. Now, I want to point out here too that just because every angle has a match and every side has a match does not mean that the two triangles are congruent. Okay, they have to be in the right spot, the same spot. Okay, like look at this Q. It has one arc, and T has one arc, so they're congruent. Okay, but another thing that has to be true for it to be a congruent triangle is that it has to be between the same two sides. Notice that Q is between the 2 tick marks and the 3 tick marks. Well, T is also between the 2 tick marks and the 3 tick marks. Okay, so that means that it's congruent, but that has to be true for all the angles. The one with 2 arcs is in between 1 and 3. The one with 2 arcs is in between 1 and 3. Okay, so even if you have matching sides and angles for everything, if they're not in the same spot, then it's not congruent triangles. All right, but now, in order to write the congruent statement, I'm just going to write that these triangles are congruent. So how do I name a triangle? Well, I name it based on its vertices, the 3 angles. Okay? So I'm going to start by saying triangle QRS. So I've got this triangle. I've named it QRS. Is congruent to, okay, now I've got to name this triangle. But here's where it's a little specific. I have to name it the right way so that it matches this triangle. So I have to look and say, okay, which angle matches the Q? Well, the T does. So triangle T, which angle matches the R? That would be the U. So U, and then which angle matches the S? That would be the V. So this is the congruent statement for these two triangles. Triangle QRS is congruent to triangle TUV. Okay, because Q and T are corresponding angles. Okay, so if Q is first, then T has to be first. And then R and U are corresponding. So if R is second, then U has to be second. And then S and V are corresponding. So if S is last, then V has to be last. Okay? And then also the sides have to match with the naming as well. Okay? Notice QR, since QR corresponds to TU, right? QR and TU, then you have QR as first and second, and TU as first and second. And then RS, that's this one, 1 tick mark, corresponds to UV. So where you have RS in second and third, you have UV in second and third. And then SQ, that's this one. SQ, that's the 3 tick marks. So that's VT. So SQ is third first. So VT is third first. Okay? All of these, the angles and the sides, must match up. If they don't, then your congruent statement is false. And if they can't match up, then it's because the two triangles are not congruent. Okay? If you can't make a true congruent statement, it's because they're not congruent. Okay? Alright. So now I'm going to let you try one. You're going to have to name the corresponding parts and write a congruence statement. Alright, so here's two triangles. Alright, now, there we go. So, you have to name all the corresponding parts. Tell me everything that's congruent to something else. All the angles, all the sides. And then you have to write a congruence statement. Alright, so go ahead and work on that, and then we'll do it together. Alright, so I'm going to start with the angles. So the first thing I'm going to look at is angle A. So angle A is congruent to what? Well, angle A has 2 tick marks, and two arcs, and angle F has 2 arcs. So that means angle A is congruent to angle F. Alright, then I'm going to look at angle B. Angle B has 3 arcs. Well, angle E has 3 arcs, so B is congruent to angle E. Then I'm looking at angle C. It has 1 arc, and D has 1 arc, so angle C is congruent to angle D. So there's my 3 congruent statements for the angles. They're the angle corresponding parts. Now I need to find the sides. Okay, so first I'm going to look at AB. That's from here to here, so that has 1 tick mark. Well, from F to E has 1 tick mark. So that means this is congruent to FE. Now notice, I didn't put EF. Okay? Now why didn't I put EF? Because I said AB. That means I went from the 2 arc angle to the 3 arc angle. Then that means I need to come over here from the 2 arc angle to the 3 arc angle. And they both have 1 tick mark, so they're congruent. Okay, same thing with the next one. I'm going to look at BC. So this has 2 tick marks, and it goes from 3 arcs to 1. So from B to C. So from E to D. From 3 arcs to 1. And yes, it has 2 tick marks. So they're congruent. So BC is congruent to ED. And then the last side is CA. So I'm going from C to A, from 1 arc to 2 arcs. And there's 3 tick marks. So if I go from 1 arc to 2 arcs over here, yes, again I have 3 tick marks, so they're congruent. So CA is congruent to DF. CA is congruent to DF. Okay, so those are all my congruent parts. And again, notice, it's almost like you could just replace the A with the F and the B with the E. Replace the A with the F and the B with the E. The B with the E and the C with the D. Okay, now, you can't just do that every time because you may have triangles that are not congruent. But if they are congruent, then that's the way it's going to happen every time. So you can kind of look over it and see if that's what happened. And if it did, then you know that you're right and you got two congruent triangles. All right, now for the congruent statement. Okay, first I start out just by naming the first triangle. Triangle ABC. Okay, the first name doesn't really matter because you can name it anything you want. But the second name has to match the first name. Okay, so I named this triangle ABC. Okay, that means I have to make the second one match. So triangle ABC is congruent to, well, which angle matches A? Okay, so it's triangle F, and then which angle matches B? So E, and then which angle matches C? So D. So my congruent statement is triangle ABC is congruent to triangle FED. Okay, this is what you're going to have to do with these problems. Identify all the corresponding parts and write a congruent statement. All right, let's try another one. Okay, this time I'm not going to draw the triangle for you. I'm going to give you a congruent statement. And you're going to write all the corresponding parts and then complete a separate congruence statement. For the same two triangles. Alright, so we've got the congruent statement is triangle TUV is congruent to triangle CDE. Okay, and you're trying to complete the congruent statement. Triangle VTU is congruent to what? Okay, so you need to start by writing all the corresponding parts and then complete this congruent statement. And then we'll look at it together. Alright, so we're going to start with our corresponding parts. So this time I don't have the triangles to look at, but since I know these are congruent, I can use these relationships. I know that these first two letters are angles that are congruent. So angle T is congruent to angle C. Right? And then I know the same thing about the second two. The second two. So angle U is congruent to angle D. And then the same thing with the third two. Angle V is congruent to angle E. Okay, so I have my three congruent sets of angles just by looking at the first letter and the first letter, the second letter and the second letter, the third letter and the third letter. So now I need to write the corresponding sides. So I can look at the first two letters, TU. So that side is going to correspond to the first two letters, CD. So I know that the side TU is congruent to the side CD. Then second and third letter with the second and third letter. So segment UV is congruent to DE. And then the last side goes from the third letter to the first letter, so VT and EC. So line VT is congruent to side EC. So those are my corresponding parts. All three corresponding angles, all three corresponding sides. And I didn't even need the triangles to do it because the congruent statement tells me all of this. Okay, now the last part, I have to complete this congruent statement for the same two triangles. Okay, so all that's happened is they renamed the first triangle, so I'm going to have to rename the second triangle to match. So instead of TUV, they named it VTU. Okay, well, that doesn't change much. I just need to match the angles. Okay, so the first one is a V. Well, V matches E, right? And the second one is a T. Well, T matches C. And the third one is a U, and U matches D. So I'm going to call this triangle ECD. Okay, because the the V is congruent to the E, angle T is congruent to angle C, and angle U is congruent to angle D. So I've written all the corresponding parts, and I've completed this congruent statement. Alright, now the last type of problem we're going to have with congruent triangles is finding missing sides. Okay, so you're going to find the value of X, Y, and Z. Okay, so here's two triangles, and I'm giving you the sides of them. Some of them have numbers, some of them have algebraic expressions. And then we have a congruent statement. Okay, so first I have triangle IJH, and over here I have triangle LMK, and this says that these two triangles are congruent. Okay, so you need to use that knowledge of which sides are congruent to solve for the missing sides. So find X, Y, and Z, and then we'll look at them together. Alright, so the first thing I'm going to do is try to find the first side. I know that angle or side MK is congruent to the side JH, because those letters are second and third, and second and third. Okay, so the side MK is congruent to JH. Well, what's the length of side MK? Well, it's 7. And what's the length of side JH? Well, it's X. So 7 equals X. Well, it looks like I found what X was. X is 7. Alright, on to the next one. Alright, next I'm going to be looking at LM and IJ, because I know that LM is congruent to IJ because they're first and second, first and second. Okay, so LM is over here, so LM is 8, and then IJ is 2y. So 8 equals 2y. Alright, well I don't have y by itself yet, but I can do that. Divide by 2, and I get that 4 equals y. So now I've figured out what y was. Alright, and then the last side, the two bottom sides down here, so I'm going to be looking at KL is congruent to HI, because KL is congruent to HI, because that's third first and third first. Okay, so KL is Z plus 1. So that's Z plus 1. And HI is 6. So Z plus 1 equals 6. So I can subtract the 1, and I get that Z equals 5. So I used my congruent statement to see which sides were equal, and then I just solved for the missing variables. X equals 7, Y equals 4, and Z equals 5. Okay, and this would work the same way if I had done angles in here. You would have just set the angles equal to each other and solved just like we did for the sides. No different. Okay, so in wrap up, you need to be able to name corresponding parts and construct a congruent statement, either by looking at triangles or by looking at a congruent statement. And you need to be able to use the congruent statement to solve for variables in the triangles, whether they're angles or the lengths of the sides. You can solve by using the congruent statement.